Christopher Columbus, celebrated explorer, a man of ambition and pain whose legacy mixes discovery with darkness. Doctors blame gout for his death, but modern historians suspect a grimmer story. Born in 1451 in Genoa to the wool weaver Domenico Colombo, Columbus grew up as a merchant's son, but always aimed higher. By the late 1470s, he was trading across Europe and, in 1479, married Felipa Moniz Perestrello, a woman with useful connections. They had a son, Diego. Columbus later sailed to West Africa, reaching as far as present-day Ghana. When Felipa died young, he settled her affairs and raised Diego. Obsessed with gold and convinced a westward sea route could reach Asia, Columbus framed his mission as both prophet and a religious crusade to spread Christianity. His calculations underestimated Earth size by about a third, a fatal miscalculation for persuading cautious backers. Portugal rejected him. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain initially dismissed him, but eventually funded his plan in April 1492 after their victory in Granada. The crown promised him governorship and a share of any riches. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus sailed with the Santa María, the Niña, and the Pinta. In the early morning of October 12th, he sighted land, Guanahani, in the central Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. Meeting the Lucayan, Taíno, and Arawak peoples, he saw potential servants and, when he found gold jewelry, demanded to be shown its source. Mistakenly convinced he'd reached the Indies, he called the people Indians for life. That first voyage spent weeks among the islands. Columbus traded, took prisoners, and left about 40 settlers on Hispaniola to build a fort before returning to Spain. His voyages launched centuries of exploration and exploitation, an achievement wrapped in controversy and human cost. Columbus was still young when a seafaring life began to wear him down. A violent storm struck just before the fleet reached Spain, and on that first return he suffered a debilitating attack of what contemporaries called gout. In March 1493, Ferdinand and Isabella hailed him as a hero. He arrived with gold, exotic goods, and captured people. Less than a year later, he sailed again, convinced he had reached Asia. After finding new islands, he returned to Hispaniola to find a fort he'd left in ruins. Locals told him that fighting over gold and the kidnapping of women had led a chieftain to burn the fort and kill its occupants. Columbus' response was to tighten control. He left deputies to conquer the island while he explored, and when he returned months later, he found brutal reprisals on both sides. What followed was a campaign of oppression. Colonists and soldiers committed atrocities against the indigenous population. Columbus enforced harsh punishments on Spaniards who crossed him. Contemporary reports say he handed indigenous women to his men, including very young girls, and sanctioned extreme corporal punishments. One woman's tongue was cut out for speaking against him. Others lost ears or noses for theft. He returned to Spain again in 1496, carrying more gold and slaves, and continued to suffer worsening illness. Fever, eye bleeding, and periodic blindness. On his third voyage, the fragile promise of empire began to fray. What had been sold at home as opportunity and grandeur, new harbors overflowed with gold, banners planted on fertile soil, fame to last through the ages, turned quickly into a harsher reality for the men and women who had been asked to stake their lives on that promise. Settlements on Hispaniola sagged under shortages, disease, and the tension between impatient settlers and a governor pledged to order. When colonists rose in rebellion, demanding the riches they had been promised and answers for their suffering, Columbus reacted with a firmness that blurred into cruelty. Dissidents were tried and put to death. Rumors of the severity of harsh punishments and administrative failure rippled back across the ocean and reached the ears of Ferdinand and Isabella. Wary of scandal and unwilling to let a single shadow mar their project of discovery and dominion, the monarch sent an investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla. He arrived with the authority of the crown and the blunt mandate to inspect the colony and its master. Bobadilla swept through the administration, seizing property and power. In chains, humiliated and stripped of his office, Columbus was sent back to Spain in 1500 to answer charges that cut to the heart of his reputation. In Madrid's austere corridors, a tale could have ended, a disgraced commander, a fallen idol. But history often moves in strange, looping ways. After hearings that mixed mercy, politics, and the lingering weight of Columbus's earlier achievements, the monarchs restored some of his wealth, dismissed Bobadilla, and, in a move that must have surprised contemporaries and historians alike, agreed to fund a fourth voyage. That agreement was as much a vote of confidence as it was a final, costly gamble. In 1502, Columbus set out one last time, confident, fearful, and perhaps looking for an opportunity to prove that his vision of the sea and its horizon still held truth. The ocean, however, would have none of it. Ferocious storms tore at rigging and hull, scattering ships and hope. By June 1503, the battered fleet had been reduced to a handful of crippled vessels, and Jamaica, a beautiful green promise, became an unintended prison. Stranded, with dwindling supplies and the morale of his men fraying, Columbus faced a predicament that tested every lesson he had learned at sea. Leadership is measured most precisely when danger leaves no room for illusions. Rescue did not come quickly. The new governor of Hispaniola, entangled in his own priorities and politics, delayed. Months passed, and the sun moved across the sky, while anxiety gathered like a storm cloud. Columbus could have surrendered to despair. Instead, he turned to the one form of knowledge that had always accompanied him across miles of empty water: the sky itself. Using astronomical tables and an understanding of the motions of the moon, he predicted a lunar eclipse, a small miracle of calculation in a time when most people still read the heavens as the language of fate. When the shadow passed across the moon on the appointed night, the event loomed vast and inexplicable to the local chiefs. Columbus used this moment not to deceive cruelly, but to demonstrate mastery of celestial rhythm and persuade them to provide food and shelter for his men. The tactic worked. Provisioned and preserved, the shipwrecked party endured until relief finally arrived in June 1504. Columbus returned to Spain that November, a man both vindicated and diminished by the experience. The homeland, however, greeted him with a different currency: legal argument and a cold reconsideration of promises. The crown balked at the financial rewards it had once pledged, pointing to his earlier dismissal as governor to challenge his claims. For Columbus, who had navigated storms and mutiny and the yawning unknowns of the Atlantic, the battle now seemed less for glory than for recognition and recompense. He carried the physical marks of his journeys: scars, exhaustion, a body eroded by years of hardship, and by the time illness took him, he was a shadow of the bold figure whose voyages had once set Europe's imagination aflame. Columbus died on May 20th, 1506, sick and exhausted at about 54. His death closed a chapter for a man whose life contained both heroic daring and moral failure. The distance between the two made his story complicated in ways that still make people argue centuries later. He had been celebrated as a discoverer, the man who opened a bridge between worlds. He had also been criticized for mismanagement, for ruthless measures against those who opposed him, and for the brutal treatment of indigenous peoples whose lives and societies were irrevocably altered by contact. In medical terms, historians now debate whether the ailments that dogged his later life were gout or reactive arthritis from infection, a reminder that even the great are subject to human frailty. In broader historical terms, the narrative has been reshaped as well. Earlier rhapsodies of unmitigated triumph have given way to a more complex account that acknowledges other journeys to the same coasts. The Norse voyages of Leif Erikson and the Viking centuries earlier, for example, and the fact that discovery is a claim with many claimants and a heavy moral price. If this account leaves us with ambivalence, that ambivalence is not a weakness, but a lesson. Columbus's story holds energy that can inspire: the courage to sail into the unknown, the resourcefulness to turn knowledge into survival, the stubbornness to continue when better men might have abandoned the quest. But it also offers caution. Resolute ambition can blind one to the rights and dignity of others. Political backing can shield poor governance, and the acclaim of one generation can be the scandal of the next. What endures is the invitation to reckon honestly with history, to admire the human capacity for curiosity and perseverance while refusing to whitewash harm. That duality can be a source of inspiration. Not a call to idolize, but a call to learn. Let Columbus remind us that exploration without empathy becomes exploitation, that courage without conscience becomes cruelty. Let his life encourage us to be brave enough to try new things, humble enough to recognize mistakes, and wise enough to repair what we can. In the end, the sea keeps its own counsel. It swallows and returns, erodes and reveals. The stories we tell about the ocean and the people who cross it should do the same. hold space for wonder and for sorrow, for the audacity that advances humanity and for the humility that keeps it humane.